Sex, Violence, and the Weather, Male Hysteria, Scale, and the Fractal Geographies of Patriarchy by Chris Lukinbeal and Stuart Aitken. First presented at the AAG in 1998 in Boston. Drawing from my own private Idaho and drugstore cowboy, we examined the role that institutionalized male hysteria plays in creating the infinite repetition and obsession of what we suggest are fractal geographies of patriarchy. In this context, fractals relate to the social patterns within patriarchy that obsessively repeat themselves and defy the constraints of scale. Patriarchy brands fractal geographies upon bodies, and moving outward through the body, it stifles agencies at larger scales by infinitely deferring, hiding, and naturalizing the constraints and psychology embedded in geographic scale. Institutionalized male hysteria empowers particular patriarchal orders by allowing some men to dominate others through the process of recoding them as effeminate. For example, much of the behavior that surrounds games, wars, and corporate battles are forms of institutionalized male hysteria, where certain types of masculinity are acceptable and others are not. To be unable to play these games or to refuse to participate is to be labeled effeminate. We argue that institutionalized male hysteria permeates and reinforces patriarchal at all scales. We assume that multiple forms of patriarchy are omnipresent at the scale of the body, families, communities, cities, and societies, but their crippling effect are hidden in part by the fractal imagery that is simultaneously independent of scale and responsible for disempowerment through scale. Many social theorists and historians have pointed out that hysteria is the primary vehicle from which all psychoanalytic theories arose. Egyptians and Greeks theorized hysteria as the wandering womb, an autonomous uterus that roamed around the body, plaguing a woman's health. From the etymological perspective, male hysteria to be hysteria at all had to be modeled after female hysteria. The diagnosis of hysteria in a man is a sign of weakness. It labels a man as a non-man. In short, it is a castration in a word. Male hysteria is the uncoding of men as men rather than the effemination of men. Once a man is uncoded or emasculated, he can be recoded as feminine. Within the context of patriarchal logic, effeminization is a key process through which hierarchy and difference is established. Male hysteria is about the domination of men over women, but also it is a means of empowering specific types of masculinity. Institutionalized male hysteria is that form of the psychosis that is condoned by most patriarchal structures. It often appears in the form of territorial games that are ideologically laden with the suppression and subjugation of the effeminate other. The marking and the production of meaning within the defined territory naturalizes patriarchal claims to power. In this sense, hysteria is a means to justify control over spatial and behavioral practices. Latent homoeroticism and sexual phobias are hidden in many of the obvious territorial conflicts that permeate such games as rugby, basketball, and warfare and geopolitical conflicts. Male hysteria in these forms is excused by patriarchal society and is hidden by institutional rhetoric. A refusal to participate in these struggles may mark behavior as effeminate or deviant. When scale is viewed as a natural ordering of the world, the subjugation of social relations at each level closes avenues for political action, thus reifying scale as sacrosanct. Dominant organizations and social structures can control subordinate groups by confining their activities to manageable scales. It is this ability to harness power at other scales or to jump scale that enables individuals and groups to effect change. Within patriarchy's naturalized structure, jumping scale implies a bodily movement up or down a geographic spatial hierarchy. In my own private Idaho, between the public street and Bob Pigeon's community and the patriarchal power base of his father's mayoral office, Scott's fight is over his resistance to the phallic power of his homophobic father. By positioning himself as threat to the phallic power of his birth father, Scott solidifies his alternate street persona by accepting Pigeon as both his lover and street father. We focus here on how Scott is able to manipulate the social geography inscribed at the side of his body, which allows him to seemingly jump patriarchal scales. Pigeon plays the Falstaff character to Scott's Prince Hal. Pigeon is Scott's teacher, of whom he will later denounce in a parody of Prince Hal's public castigation of Falstaff in Shakespeare's Henry IV, Part 1. Van Zandt uses Shakespeare to suggest an intriguing Oedipal intertextuality. Both Scott and Prince Hal slum with street people to ensure that their return to their father's court will be momentous and spectacular. Once distanced from Pigeon's court, Scott confesses that he has always been planning to change his image back to the world of his father's dominant norm. This conceit is spatially reinforced when Scott returns from Italy with his new fiancée. While driving through the streets of Portland, Scott's limousine passes by Mike Huddle's body on the sidewalk. With this simple scene, Van Zandt contrives the limousine as what Dissertot would call a bubble of panoptic and classifying power, a module of imprisonment that makes possible the production of order, a closed and autonomous insularity. Scott has now jumped scale, has removed his body from the street and imposed a physical boundary between himself and Mike. For the rest of the movie, he inhabits sites of compliance rather than resistance: the limousine, the trendy bar, the traditional pompous site of the mayoral funeral. The concept of jumping down economic and social scale is an old myth with a long lineage. Shakespeare's story of Prince Hal came during the Age of Discovery, when imperial expansion and colonization introduced England to a number of new cultures and social practices. Scott's jumping down suggests a control of scale that enables patriarchal culture an opportunity to appropriate its marginal social elements so that, like Hal, the different, strange, and gross could be extracted, recited, and thus foreclosed. It seems reasonable to argue that this jumping down through scale is a variation of the hero saga, though with males find socially acceptable means to discover their manhood. It seems reasonable to argue that this jumping down through scale is a variation of the hero saga, through which males find socially acceptable means to discover their manhood. The hero's tale enforces dominant behavioral roles that seek to naturalize culturally inscribed prototypes of masculinity. With the naturalization of mythic struggles, prescribed masculine modes of behavior are recycled in heroes' tales. Mythic heroes are institutionalized forms of hysteria. They provide established means through which men can obtain or regain the phallus. Scott's institutionalized male hysteria enabled him to mimic the lack of the phallus. Scott's hysteria is a performance of power and a fractal that connects him to the grand lineage of male heroes. Scott's gender and social class enable him to mime homosexuality and lower social economic class to dispose of desires and anxieties around economic and gender instabilities. Through a contrived hysteria, he empowers himself by weaving associations to a tradition that relates to the son's challenge of the father's power, a laudable heroic and institutionalized hysteria. Another form of institutionalized male hysteria appears in Drugstore Cowboy, another movie of Van Zandt's, where territorial battles are prime examples of where institutionalized hysteria seeks to construct, scale, and subordinate the other through signifying them as effeminate. At the time Drugstore Cowboy was released in 1989, Van Zandt's portrayal of drug use was in stark contrast to the hysteria that characterized the war on drugs and the insensitive Just Say No campaigns of the Reagan-Bush administration. Institutionalized hysteria around drug use is about an assumed moral supremacy that highlights Foucault's point that society always needs a group to gaze upon and thereby to subjugate. At Drugstore Cowboy, we witness the ways that drug hysteria enforces control over the streets and poor suburbs, enabling police to disrupt and regulate private lives. On the front lines of these street battles is the panoptic gaze of the police, who are ironically portrayed as inept hysterics. They treat Bob and his gang with contempt, beating them up and destroying their property. In the first territorial battle, Gentry leads the police raid that destroys Bob's house. Bob asks Gentry, "Do you have a warrant?" To which Gentry asserts his phallic dominance by stating, "Yeah, I got a warrant. It's pasted at the end of one of these slugs." During the raid, Bob's private space is destroyed, and he's made a public, effeminized spectacle in front of his family. The police have intruded, marked, and destroyed Bob's private space and asserted their dominant power over Bob and his gang. The morning after the police raid, the family lies naked in the rubble of the living room as if their bodies had been violated by the police. When Bob and his gang find a new residency, the panoptic gaze of the police emanates from a camper parked in the nearby street. Bob manipulates the gaze through a mischievous plot that makes him appear to be hiding his drugs in the house next door. In the police's zealous attempt to locate the drugs, an undercover agent gets shot and wounded by the owner of the house. The next day, Gentry advises Bob to take a nice long drive somewhere far away from here, to which Bob retorts, "Wait a minute, Gentry, I won the goddamn war, not you. Who are you to dictate the terms? Why don't you go find a small town police department where you can step in as sheriff, where all you have to worry about is the usual Saturday night drunks and kids messing around?" In a sarcastic reversal of power positioning, Bob not only challenges Gentry, but crowns himself winner of this territorial battle. The enraged cop grabs Bob, and Gentry proceeds to punch him in the stomach. Shortly afterward, Bob packs up his crew and leaves on a road trip, a traditional cure for male hysteria. Male hysteria's central and perhaps most promising feature is the capacity for a deep relativization of gender norms. However, through weaving scales, fractals of prescribed behavioral norms, patriarchy maintains its dominance and allows sanctioned forms of institutionalized male hysteria to be performed and imprinted upon our bodies. Scott's capitulation to his father's institutionalized hysteria is aided by the revisioning of the hero narrative as an acceptable means through which men from the upper class can mimic hysteria, jump scales, and return to the safe confines of the fatherland.